There's an interesting article that was actually just posted by James Castorius, who joins us today. He is the founder of Investor Acumen and also a prominent author at Seeking Alpha, discussing some of the background info that many of you may not realize about what's going on with the Middle Eastern war and how this is not over. We're going to dive into a lot of this today. It's going to be very informative. So, James, the title of the piece, and I'll have a link out to it where this interview is located, Financial Sense. It's called Mid-East War Presents Extraordinary Risks and Opportunities After U.S. Presidential Election. I know it's generating a lot of comments and buzz. Let's jump into it. How are you looking at what's happening in the Middle East relative to the U.S. election? Let's start there.
That's an interesting place to start. Well, from the very beginning, the strategies on the part of the different players that I think are playing a big role in what's going on in the Middle East have been paying close attention to the date of US presidential elections. Because what happens in the course of this conflict and in this war in the Middle East could actually have an impact. For example, the timing and the manner in which Israel responded to the massive missile attack by the Iranians on October 1st, where they fired over 200 missiles and over 180 some odd actually were able to penetrate into Israel. The Israelis were putting together their response, and Joe Biden was, and his administration was putting very heavy pressure on the Israelis to sort of temper their response and temper their retaliation because they didn't want an all-out war to break out right before the election, thereby hurting Kamala Harris's chances. So I think that the Israelis made a very intelligent tactical concession, not a strategic concession, but a tactical concession in order to firm up their support with the United States, and in particular with the Biden and potential future Harris administration, by actually playing ball with them and saying, okay, we are going to delay our planned response towards Iran. And that planned response is, and I'm going to discuss this a little later with you, involves actually going after Iran's nuclear facilities and other key strategic facilities possessed by the Iranians. The Israelis basically told the Americans, okay, we're going to withhold doing that because we know that if we go that route, that will trigger an all-out war. And you're saying you don't want an all-out war before the election. So what we want is just to make sure that you're going to support us 100% when and if an all-out war breaks out. And I do believe that Biden did provide those sorts of assurances to the Israelis. And I believe that the Israelis also think that they'll have those same sort of assurances if Donald Trump is elected. So as you can see, all along the line here, the US presidential election has actually played a very important strategic role in the thinking of the various players that are a part of this Middle East conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as we know, there's a lot of back channel communication that is happening about these events. And like you're saying, I mean, the Biden Harris administration absolutely does not want a major escalation in the Middle Eastern war right before the elections, because if that happens, then we see a big spike in oil prices, gas prices go up. And I mean, I forget what it is, but there is an extremely tight correlation between gas prices and presidential approval ratings. So that's the last thing that you want right before an election is a spike in gas and oil prices, inflation to go up. So clearly they're going to be leaning on the IDF, on the Israeli government to say, hey, just hold off. Let's temper things. Try not to escalate things further until after the election, like you said. So the big question then is, why do you think that Israel is poised to continue? What remarks have they made, or what is the bigger picture scenarios you see that is a high probability scenario that they are just postponing a larger attack or potentially escalation?
Absolutely, Chris. Well, I do think that it is highly probable that the Israelis are going to engage the Iranians in an all out war sometime in the next few months, because I think they've already made a strategic decision that they need to engage the Iranians now in an all out war while the Israelis still possess a strategic advantage relative to the Iranians militarily. In other words, the Israelis possess nuclear weapons, the Iranians still don't. The Israelis still have technological and military superiority in many areas. The Iranians are very quickly catching up, but they really haven't quite caught up yet. And I think that basically a lot of the military leadership in Israel and a lot of their political leadership have decided that a military confrontation with Iran is inevitable in the long run. And so that if this conflict is inevitable in the long run, they want to have this conflict at a time where they still possess a strategic upper hand. And that strategic upper hand is something that will probably only last for a few months, maybe a year or two longer. So they need to basically execute on this strategy relatively quickly. And many Israeli leaders have actually pointed out that right now is probably the best opportunity that the Israelis will ever have to engage in this war with the Iranians, precisely because the Iranians have very clearly attacked the Israelis directly, and also because the entire world understands that a lot of the attacks that Israel has been suffering in the last year have come as a direct result of the financing, the ideological training, the military assistance, the technological transfer of the Iranians to Israeli enemies that have been firing missiles at Israel, that have been terrorizing Israel from various different angles, and implementing this, or what's called a ring of fire strategy, whereby Israel is essentially surrounded on all sides by Iranian proxy forces that are attacking Israel from various sides. And I think that much of the world is right now sympathetic to the Israelis to the extent that the Israelis strike back at Iran. And many people around the world also understand, at least to some extent, not to the extent that the Israelis themselves do, that these threats are actually existential to the state of Israel. And that's another point that I want to talk to you about a little bit as well, which is that Israeli thinking about Iran has shifted radically in the last year to one of a much greater sense of urgency about the existential threat that is posed by Iran to the very existence of the state of Israel. So, therefore, Israel feels that it has a strategic urgency to essentially get rid of the existential threat that Iran poses, that the Islamic Republic of Iran poses to Israel. And that strategic urgency is going to lead them to eventually strike at Iran's nuclear facilities, try to take out their entire nuclear program, and which is also leading the Israelis to have an explicit goal to do everything they can to try to overthrow the Iranian regime and to try to catalyze regime change from within in Iran. That's an extremely ambitious goal, but it's one that is now very much part of Israeli policy. So these two objectives, the taking out of the nuclear facilities and bringing about regime change in Iran, are two objectives that can only be accomplished from their point of view by severely defeating the Iranians militarily and by taking out their nuclear facilities and also their military capabilities. Because right now, Israel actually faces a more or less existential threat just from the conventional weapons that the Iranians possess, the thousands upon thousands of missiles that the Iranians are able to fire at the Israelis. That in itself poses an existential threat. And so the Israelis need to take out Iran's ability to produce missiles and drones at this scale, because, again, the Israelis are convinced that sooner or later they will be faced with a war with Iran. And so, from their point of view, they need to have this war now rather than later.
And again, these aren't your opinions. This is just based on the comments that have been stated by Israeli leaders. And you quote a number of different people. The thinking process right now is that there's a window of opportunity. They have a strategic advantage in taking out the Iranian nuclear facilities and their development of nuclear weapons. They understand the threat. They need to take advantage of this now. However, it has been temporarily postponed, as you're pointing out, because of the US elections, Biden and Harris administration putting some pressure on them to not escalate things further, at least right before the election. So, if we are to see them commence in what are their strategic objectives, that's likely going to happen sometime after, and perhaps not too long after the elections are all sorted out. And then they can figure out, Israel as well, can figure out which president they're going to be dealing with. So you talked about Israel. They have a strategic advantage. They're in a race against time, essentially, to get this implemented and completed before Iran gains back some type of strategic advantage against Israel. So they're trying to get this done sooner than rather than later. You also talk about Iran. So clearly, Israel is reacting to Iran as well. There was the October 7th attacks last year. We all saw that. We knew what happened. That was akin to, as Benjamin Netanyahu had said, their own Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about what you point out in your article when it comes to the Iranian side, based on what they believe and why they are so intent on building these nuclear weapons and the comments that they made about what they will do with them.
Yeah. Well, I will get into that, but I just want to actually maybe follow up on a point that you made in your question here, which is implicit in your question, is that what has shifted in terms of Israeli thinking that has led them to have this urgency. Um, Now, obviously, the October 7th attacks were a big shock to the Israelis. But that shock and that terrorist attack by itself probably would not be enough to induce Israeli leaders to engage in an all out war against Iran. It's really been a series of events that have occurred since October 7th that I believe have firmly convinced Israeli leaders and created a sort of consensus amongst the majority of Israeli military and political leaders that they must go after what they call, or what has been called, the head of the octopus, being Iran, because basically there's a strategy of a ring of fire that the Iranians have implemented, which is to surround Israel with proxy forces, and these are the sort of the tentacles of the octopus, proxy forces in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, even some forces operating out of Jordan and the West Bank and Gaza. And the Israelis realize exactly how much of an existential threat these proxy forces actually pose to the existence of the state of Israel. A lot of these proxy forces have gained access to really deadly weaponry. And so the Israelis really sort of shifted their strategic thinking to one of a greater sense of urgency to deal with the force that has been financing these terrorist attacks on Israel from these various fronts, that have been providing these groups with armaments and with technology and with money. And I think that one of the key moments for the Israelis was what happened in northern Israel. Now, as you and some of your readers know, as a result of indiscriminate rocket attacks coming out of southern Lebanon fired by Hezbollah, we're talking about hundreds and even thousands of missiles per month were fired into northern Israel. Roughly 60,000 to 80,000 Israelis were forced to evacuate their homes in the north of Israel. This is a pretty substantial chunk of population. But what Israelis realized is that that is the future that the entirety of Israel faces. Because right now, Hezbollah only possessed, I would say, low tech missiles that had very limited range and that weren't actually guided missiles. They were missiles that they could fire in great quantity. Hezbollah was believed to have something like 100,000 to 150,000 rockets, but almost all of that were unguided missiles and missiles that had relatively short range. But Israel knows that it's only a matter of time. We're talking a matter of months, at most a year, before Hezbollah would be able to extend the range of their missiles and also be able to obtain guided missile technology that they could actually attach to their current missile arsenal. And that would make their attacks far more deadly. The type of attacks that Hezbollah conducted in northern Israel were just almost random attacks of rockets that rained down in different places. And occasionally the rockets would land on a house or on a business or something. But most of the time it was landing in open fields or in forest, causing forest fires and so forth. And so what the Israelis saw is that, hey, if these guys are able to cause a huge portion of our population in northern Israel to have to evacuate just firing these kind of missiles sort of randomly, they can essentially run our entire population out of the country if they're able to extend the range of their missiles and actually get guided missiles where they're actually able to pinpoint accuracy, hit population centers, economic infrastructure, and so forth. So this is what brought about a great sense of urgency, because in what happened in northern Israel, the Israeli leadership and also many Israeli citizens said that's going to be the future of our country unless we militarily take on Hezbollah and destroy them. But it will be of no use to us to destroy Hezbollah if the head of the octopus that is financing this terror group is able to continue indefinitely to continue to finance these groups and provide them with technology and missiles. And we have to be clear: the Iranians have the sort of guided missile technology that they have and would continue to provide Hezbollah with over time. So this wasn't just some little theory. Hezbollah today has some relatively small quantity of guided missiles, some of which they have actually managed to hit targets in Israel with. They were able to hit some targets in Haifa recently. And so it was just a matter of time before the Iranians were able to smuggle in these sort of guided missiles with longer range, but also these missiles could be manufactured within Lebanon itself using Iranian technology. And so when the Israelis saw that how effective Hezbollah had been able to be, they really realized that the strategic objective, and this is something that Israeli intelligence forces had gathered from documents and overhearing conversations, but also there's public statements to this effect that have actually been found, that the stated strategy of the Iranians was to precisely terrorize the Israelis with these proxy forces, firing missiles into Israel and also using sort of guerrilla style ground attacks like the one that happened on October 7th to essentially terrorize and exhaust the Israeli population into abandoning Israel, essentially leaving Israel. And of course, this would enable the destruction of the Israeli state and the emergence of a single Palestinian state in its place as the Israeli population essentially evacuated.
Yeah, because Iran is not pro two-state solution, obviously.
No, they're not at all. They don't accept a two-state solution. They believe that the only acceptable solution is a one-state solution, which is a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem.
Right. Free Palestine is basically there.
Correct. And from the river to the sea. So there's no place in Iranian thinking for a two-state solution. And so their long-term strategy is to simply terrorize the Israelis over the long run, causing the population to essentially evacuate or leave Israel, and also to tear the society apart in internal divisions. Because, and this was also something that they talked about amongst themselves, which is that they noted that every time the Israelis have to respond to acts of terrorism coming from wherever they are, Israeli society becomes extremely divided. And they actually we were able to see what happened right in the aftermath of October 7th, that many Israelis were extremely divided about what to do. A lot of Israelis, for example, wanted to not attack Gaza militarily and certainly not Lebanon, but just wanted to focus on negotiation to get the hostages back. And this very severely divided Israeli society. And a lot of Israelis are very divided precisely about what to do about these threats that they face from their various neighbors. So the Iranians believed that they could eventually, through what they call strategic patience, this is a term that they use, through strategic patience, through just nonstop attacks by proxy forces surrounding Israel, both aerial attacks through missiles and also sort of guerrilla style incursions into Israeli territory, they could eventually destroy the state of Israel. And in this regard, the Iranians have a very specific timeline and goal. The supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has stated in 2015 the goal of eradicating and annihilating the state of Israel by the year 2040. It was a 25-year plan. And he has been very specific in enumerating a number of steps that he wanted the Iranians to take in order to bring about this goal. And this is something that's been taken very seriously within Iran and within the Iranian military. And it's an objective that is actually shared by many in the Iranian regime to the extent that there's actually a public clock in Tehran in a place called Palestine Square that is counting down the time until the destruction of Israel in 2040. So if you can imagine that, we have in the United States, we have a Times Square clock counting down the national debt. And, we're familiar with these types of clocks, but this clock is actually a clock that is counting down the time until the destruction of Israel. So this is um, essentially an unofficial state policy. And when I say unofficial, it's really official in the sense that the supreme leader of Iran dictates all policy. So everything that he says uh, needs to be implemented. And this has become even more true over the years because they've developed a doctrine of infallibility with respect to the pronouncements of the supreme leader. And so, even though there isn't a specific law, there was a law actually introduced into the Iranian parliament a few years ago that would an explicit law in Iran to pursue the destruction of the state of Israel by 2041. Now that was never actually brought to a vote, but it was actually proposed in the Iranian parliament. But what is a fact, and what we do know, is that this is the stated goal of the supreme leader of Iran. And everything the supreme leader is something that the entire organism of the state is bound to essentially try to place into effect. And we also know that this is a central goal of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They have been ideologically indoctrinated in this idea that the state of Israel must be annihilated. And so, given how the Israelis over time have understood how deadly serious the Iranians are about annihilating the state of Israel, and they realize that this is no longer sort of just a fringe thing that a few people in Iran believe, or that it's just something that's being said for populist reasons or to threaten, that these are actually actionable plans that are being formulated and executed within Iran in order to bring about this goal of eradicating and annihilating the state of Israel by 2040. So it's precisely in this context of Israelis understanding how deadly serious the Iranians are about this, and also looking at the success that Iranian proxies have had in terrorizing the Israelis, the success, for example, that Hezbollah had in causing 60 to 80,000 Israelis to have to evacuate their homes and their livelihoods in northern Israel, the success that the Houthis of Yemen have had in disrupting Israeli shipping and attacking Israeli ports. All of these things have made the Israelis realize that, hey, if these guys are having this much success in disrupting our nation, imagine what's going to happen if we let them continue to implement this plan by 2040. It's actually a known fact that Netanyahu, in his most recent visit to New York, actually spoke unofficially with a number of foreign leaders and diplomats about the intelligence that they've been able to gather from the Iranians about their concrete plans to destroy Israel by 2040. And so Netanyahu believes, and former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett believes, even former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who is on the left, he's a Labor Party leader in Israel. They have all come to a consensus that as a result of this existential threat, that Israel must engage Iran in a essentially an all-out war that aims to A, take out their nuclear facilities, and B, try to bring about regime change, or at the very least to debilitate the Iranian regime so severely that they will no longer pose this sort of existential threat. Because the Israelis essentially believe, and I think they're correct, that from their point of view, if they simply deal a military defeat to Iran, or if they are able to defeat Iran militarily in some conflict that they have in the next few months, and the Iranian Islamic regime is able to survive this, then we're going to just be back to square one in a couple of years. In other words, the Islamic Republic of Iran and its leadership, if it remains in power, it will always have as its goal the destruction of the state of Israel. So even if the Israelis manage to defeat them militarily today, 2 years from now, the Iranians will be able to reconstitute themselves and their forces. And in the meantime, technology progresses. The ease with which the Iranians will be able to acquire various types of weapons and armaments, and their ability to build up their nuclear program will only increase over time. So the Israelis have become convinced that it's not sufficient to simply defeat the Iranians militarily, but that they also need to do everything in their power to try to overthrow this regime, or to enable the overthrow of the regime, or at the very least to debilitate this regime to such a severe degree that they're not able to pose an existential threat to Israel in the future.
Now, James, you talk about this is a really interesting part of the article, and some of our listeners may be familiar with this, but I don't know. It's a little bit esoteric, but I think it is just a fascinating aspect to this conversation. And that's where you get into a little bit more on the war with Israel from Iran's perspective and the theology of Iran, and why, of course, Israel needs to take these comments seriously. I mean, the pushback is probably, and some of the comments I noticed said this as well, that basically, well, Israel shouldn't be taking these comments, these threats, existential threats of annihilating Israel off the face of the map by 2040, and all of those things that you just outlined that have been made, statements that have been made from Iran. Well, you don't need to take those things seriously, but you point out that this is actually this is a deeply rooted religious theology that is guiding Iran's policies and Iran's foreign policy towards Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about the messianic creed of Mahdism? I think it's Mahdiism or Mahdism.
Okay, well, this is actually a very, very lengthy and sort of difficult subject. I'll try to summarize it as best I can, but I also like to invite you to ask me any questions that you have along the way, or after I try to kind of summarize the issue. The real issue here is that since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, there has been a revolutionary, truly revolutionary, and a radical shift in religious thinking in Iran. It's something that's actually unprecedented in the history of Islam, and particularly Shia Islam, which had a theology which, over the course of over 1,000 years of history, essentially espoused a theory of what's called quietism. Now, quietism, in the context of Islam, and particularly in terms of Shia Islam, essentially means that the religious clerics and the religious establishment should not get involved in politics, and should not get involved in the management of government or the state at all. Because the idea being that only with the return of the Mahdi, who is the 12th Imam, and there's a whole, let's say, theology surrounding this particular historical figure, about the fact that over 1,000 years ago, he went into a state of divine hiding, and that he's actually alive on earth, but he's in a state of divine hiding, and that he will actually reappear in the end days, at the end of times, to come and essentially assist the Islamic world in defeating evil and bringing about justice in the world. Now, in accordance with the traditional interpretation in Shia Islam, only when the Mahdi makes his reappearance should religion play a role in state affairs, military affairs, and so forth. And in the meantime, Muslims were enjoined to simply obey the secular authorities and the laws of the secular authorities. And there shouldn't be any contradiction on the part of the clerics in the governance of the state. Now, this 1,000+ year tradition was radically overturned in Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And there's been an evolution since the time of Khomeini up until the present time, which people in the West are not actually aware of at all. This is a huge blind spot for the West, which is that since the revolution, there's been a whole, let's say, evolution of thinking in Iran about the role of the religious leadership and the role of religious edicts in the governing of the country, and in particular, to what concerns us here, in the governing of foreign policy and military policy. Essentially, the doctrine that's evolved over the years is one in which the Islamic revolutionary Republican leadership in Iran needs to actively seek to set the stage and to create the conditions for the return of the Mahdi, that they're not going to just sit passively by and wait for him to reappear, that they actually need to do certain things that will create the conditions that will bring about the return of the Mahdi. And over the years, there's been like the idea has been developed that a necessary condition for the return of the Mahdi is to engage Israel, or what they call the Zionists, in an all-out war. And it will be sometime after this all-out war and sort of a massive world war that will be triggered. And in the midst of that turbulence, that the Mahdi will make his reappearance in history. Now, this all sounds, like you said, very esoteric to those of us in the West. And it's almost, we in the West have a way of sort of dismissing this sort of thing and thinking that, well, like, yeah, we would never think that way. So, and we assume that all humans are the same. And so the Iranians must not actually allow that sort of religious thinking to influence them too much. But this is a severe misunderstanding. This is something that is believed very, very deeply by the Iranian religious establishment, particularly by the current supreme leader, Khamenei. It was also something that was really, really accelerated and brought forward by former President Ahmadinejad of Iran, who was a very, very, I would say, fanatical follower of Mahdiism in Iran. And again, there within the Iranian population, there isn't any kind of a uniform interpretation or set of beliefs regarding the Mahdi. There's actually quite a lot of diversity of opinion. But what the population believes isn't actually important. What's important is what the Iranian leadership that controls the apparatus of the state, and in particular the military apparatus, it's what they believe that really matters.
Right.
And so, what we have to understand is that in Iran there is a military force which is the most important in Iran, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, this Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is a military organization that runs in parallel to the normal or the regular Iranian army, but it's an army and an armed force that is not in the service of the let's say the ordinary Iranian people. It's in the service of the revolutionary forces of Iran. So it answers to the supreme leader. In this sense, it's something a little bit similar to what Hitler had with the SS and with what other leaders around the world have done, is to sort of create a parallel force that's loyal to a specific party or a specific leader rather than to the entire state apparatus. But as you know, the IRGC has gained enormous amounts of power in Iran, militarily, even economically, because they've been given management of a lot of key industries in Iran. And the IRGC, about 50% roughly of the training of IRGC members is ideological in nature. And what I mean by ideological is that is essentially they're indoctrinated into religious interpretations that lead them to, let's say, a very fanatical support of the supreme leader and his edicts, and a complete and blind loyalty to his commands. And part of this training, as a part of this training, is the idea that the key goal of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is to help create these conditions and set the stage for the return of the Mahdi. And within the IRGC, it's very popularly believed that an essential component of this, that in fact, a necessary component of this, is going to be a war with Israel. And so over the years, the Israelis have obviously been monitoring this situation very carefully. And they have realized just how serious this has become in terms of, from an ideological perspective, how deeply they have managed to indoctrinate the younger generation. Now, it's interesting because in the West, mainly what we hear about is the fact that there's a younger generation in Iran that's highly disaffected with the theocratic regime, and a lot of disaffection with religion. Like, one thing that you may have heard is that um, a lot of mosques in Iran have actually had to shut down because attendance has collapsed, and that there's in general terms, there's sort of a religious crisis going on in Iran, where a lot of Iranians are turning to either agnosticism, atheism, or there's even been a pretty major underground resurgence of Christianity in Iran. But parallel to this development in the kind of the broader culture, if we look at the microculture of what's happening within the government of Iran, that's led by the supreme leader and the mullahs, and what's happening in the IRGC, these organs of the state have actually become far more radicalized than they were 10 years ago, even, or 20 years ago. And so these organs have actually gone in the opposite direction of what's happening in the sort of the general Iranian population. It's actually become more extreme. But again, it's really the Iranian clerical leadership, which are the guardians of the state in accordance with they are what's called the jurists, that are the guardians of the states in accordance with the revolutionary doctrine. And the IRGC is the army that is that essentially supports the revolution within Iran. And from that specific point of view, these religious leaders and the military leaders have become more fanatical, more extreme, and more committed to their ideological goals. And so amongst those ideological goals are the destruction of the state of Israel by 2040. And that is part of the context here that a lot of people don't really understand, that there's really that the Israelis have come to understand that from the Iranian point of view, there's no negotiating with this. There's no way to compromise with this type of ideology that's committed to their annihilation. And the Iranians actually have a very long-term plan of strategic patience. They're not rushing to destroy Israel by 2025. They've given themselves until 2040. But again, the Israelis believe that they can't afford to wait and allow the Iranians to gather the strength over the course of the next 14 years, 15 years, that would actually enable the Iranians to bring about their goal of eradicating the state of Israel. So that's kind of the broad context that we're dealing with here, which is a deep radicalization of the religious regime of the military in Iran, and there is Israeli consciousness of this, and their realization that this existential threat by Iran is very, very serious, and that they need to essentially confront Iran while they still possess a strategic upper hand.
Yeah, and I want to point out that this article, again, will have linked out to, you have a lot of citations, a lot of links out to various references, news articles backing up what the Iranians have said from various leaders along the lines of what you pointed out earlier, the rise of Mahdiism, as you were discussing, and how that is deeply rooted into the Revolutionary Guard there in Iran. the comments made from the Israeli side when it comes to, seeing this window of opportunity that they need to take advantage of before time runs out, given the threat that is posed by Iran and them getting a nuclear weapon. Of course, like you said, their stated goal of destroying Israel by 2040, bringing about the Mahdi, their 12th Imam, their own Messiah. So they need to take these statements seriously. And clearly, Iran is working as hard as it can through its own proxies, through its own technological capabilities, through its nuclear capabilities to move further in that direction. Obviously, Israel would be stupid if they just said, this is just some fringe belief and we can ignore, because they're not going to act on that. So let's say after the elections, we see Israel now pursue this objective because we've now seen the election outcome. We know who's president at that time, whether or not it's Harris or Trump. They've pushed it off, they've postponed it, and then now they're willing to commence with this plan to try to root out the elements, the extremist elements from Iran that have this goal of eliminating Israel. What happens from that point? I mean, what do you think would be a very likely scenario that we could be looking at in terms of disruption or impact on global markets, the global economy? What are some of the scenarios that you're looking at?
So the first thing that I think that you're kind of asking me is in terms of timing. Right after the elections, are we going to see some sort of action immediately after the elections? Is this something going to get drawn out? Admittedly, I don't have any sort of inside information on this, and so my comments are, based on my assessments. But this is kind of what I perceive is going on at the present time from Israel's point of view. As I said, their strategic objectives are two: to destroy Iran's nuclear capability, to destroy also any military capability they have that threatens the state of Israel. And two, they want to bring about if at all possible, an overthrow of the Iranian Islamic regime, or at the very least, weaken this regime internally to such an extent that they will no longer pose a major threat in the future. And I think that the Israelis are not going to at all compromise or sacrifice on these major strategic objectives that they have. And so the question is, when are they going to start acting upon those strategic objectives to bring them about? I think that they're probably going to start almost immediately after the election. And this is why. First of all, let's imagine that Trump actually wins the next presidential election. I think that what they want to do is they want to start the war while Biden is still president. I think that they've already secured Biden's support and the support of the Biden administration in whatever military actions they decide to take. The U.S. essentially going to have Israel's back in defending them. The U.S. may not participate in offensive operations, but what Israel mainly needs from the United States is for the United States to help to defend the Israelis from various counterstrikes by the Iranians.
Which we've done, right?
Yes, and which we've done already. And we've already beefed up our forces. The United States has actually sent a tremendous amount of forces in the area to essentially beef up security. And they've also provided Israel with a number of defensive armaments. And so I think that all the signals are pretty clear that the Biden administration is essentially going to have Israel's back if Israel decides to go forward. And I think that they're going to go forward quickly for two reasons. First of all, if Trump, as I said, if Trump is elected, Trump is going to want to come in like a knight in shining armor and be able to claim credit for bringing an end to the war during his term. And essentially, I think it's to the advantage of the Israelis to let him have that sort of victory, because if Trump is going to be the president for the next 4 years, they want him to be on their side. And so therefore, if Trump is able to say that he helped bring about an end to the war, that's already a big feather in his cap. So in order to accomplish that objective, what the Israelis would do would be to attack Iran before Trump is actually inaugurated. They would have essentially 2 months to go after the Iranians, knowing that they still have the support of the Biden administration. And then after they've basically been pounding on the Iranians for a couple of months and probably already achieved their strategic objectives by then Trump can come in and say, you know what, I think we've got enough. We've had enough. Let's bring an end to this. And then Trump can claim credit for, brokering a deal that brings an end to the war, and that brings down oil prices and so forth. So I think that that's the scenario that the Israelis are looking at in the event of a Trump victory.
So you're talking about regime change over that 2-month period after the elections. Is that the time window that you're looking at?
That's a great question you asked. No, I think that what I was mainly referring to there was that they would go after their nuclear facilities and other military and their military facilities. Probably not their oil facilities unless the Iranians actually manage to hit economic infrastructure in Israel. But if they don't, they probably won't involve the Iranian oil facilities. But yeah, I think their main target and their main strategic objective is going to be to destroy their nuclear facilities. Now, in the process, that's going to trigger an all-out war. And the idea is, from the Israeli point of view, is that if the Iranians are soundly defeated militarily, that this military defeat will so debilitate the the Iranian regime and will so harm the reputation and the ability of the Iranian regime to govern that hopefully there will be forces in Iran that will emerge from the ashes, so to speak, and try to take power. And the Israelis would obviously try to uh, assist or help this bring about. And who knows, the Americans might actually do this as well. And this could actually be, this sort of an internal power struggle could be going on, and this sort of civil war could be going on for many months after a direct war between Israel and Iran is essentially over. So basically, what I'm saying is that the Israelis would like to get most of their military damage done before the inauguration. And then some of the, let's say, civil war that's going on, this might actually take place over a series of months, even while Trump is in office. But from Trump's point of view, he doesn't really care if there's a civil war going on in Iran, as long as there's not an all out war that's actually causing oil prices to rise. He probably wouldn't be at all unhappy if the Iranian regime was overthrown. But I doubt if Trump is going to want to get involved specifically in a kind of regime change campaign. I think he's even said that he's not interested in that. Vice President elect Vance, or he's not Vice President elect, but candidate for Vice President Vance has said that the United States shouldn't be getting involved in this sort of regime change type of thing. So I don't think that they're gonna the Israelis are necessarily counting on direct support from the Americans, or at least not large scale direct support. Um, but what I think that what they believe is that if they're able to inflict a heavy enough military defeat on the Iranian regime, that over some period of time, the regime will essentially crumble and topple, and other, let's say, more reformist and pro democratic forces in Iran might be able to seize power. I'm not at all speculating about whether that's going to be possible, but I think that that's what the Israelis are sort of aiming for. Now, that's obviously the scenario in which Trump is elected. But I also think that even if Vice President Harris is elected, the Israelis are going to want to go ahead and attack as soon as possible, because I think that they may believe that they'll have stronger support from Biden than they will from a Harris administration, or at least that's something that they don't necessarily want to take a risk with or gamble on. In other words, I do believe that based on his history and his background, Biden is a lot more likely to provide very strong support to Israel than Harris has. That would be based on their previous policy statements and so forth. Now, who knows? Maybe Harris will fully support Israel and try to show herself to be a strong leader and so forth by militarily intervening on the side of the Israelis after the election. I mean, that's very hard to predict, but I think the Israelis don't want to get into the game of predicting that either. I think they feel that they've already secured the support of Joe Biden for essentially having the Israelis back if the Israelis decide to strike at Iran after the election. And so the Israelis will want to fully avail themselves of the implicit promises by the Biden administration. And not necessarily wait until Kamala Harris is president, where she may have advisors and she herself may have different ideas than Biden does and just different personnel. That would be kind of a big risk for the Israelis to take, because obviously, when you have a different president, that president's going to think differently, and you're also going to have personnel, and that personnel is going to think differently. But they already know who the players are in the Biden administration, and they already know what support they have from them. So I think they're going to want to take advantage of that support and the goodwill that they've been able to build with them. And therefore, that's why I think that they're more likely to attack sooner rather than later, right after the election. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's a certainty. That's what my assessment is, based on the fact that I think that the Israelis have already made the strategic decision that they're going to do this. And so when I think in terms of the timing, I think it just simply makes sense for them to do this as soon as possible after the election, whether it be Trump that wins or Harris that wins, for the two reasons that I just mentioned.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So maybe as we close things out, any other aspects that you're looking at this economically speaking, oil prices, what are some potential scenarios that you're looking at if things do proceed in this direction?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing, Chris, is that Iran, if there is an all out war with Israel and the United States, which is something that Iran actually doesn't want, they want to engage in their strategy of strategic patience and essentially try to annihilate Israel slowly, uh, over a very long period through 2040.
Death by a thousand cuts, it sounds like.
Yes, death by a thousand cuts. They don't necessarily want to engage Israel in a direct, all-out war. And one of the reasons they don't want to do that is, first of all, they would probably lose in a direct military confrontation with Israel. But they also know that if they get into an all-out war with Israel, they're essentially going to be getting into an all-out war with the United States, because the United States is going to essentially intervene in this war on behalf of Israel. And Iran knows that doesn't stand a chance if the United States combines forces with the Israelis. They will be facing a certain military defeat. And so, in that context, the if there actually is an all-out war that breaks out and Iran is facing a certain military defeat, the Iranians have essentially two big trump cards that they can try to pull to essentially try to salvage their regime. The first is to block all commercial traffic, and particularly traffic of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 20% of global oil supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz. If oil supplies were to be disrupted through the Strait of Hormuz, we're likely to have a scenario that is as bad or probably even worse than the one that we had in 1973 during the Arab oil embargo. During the Arab oil embargo, oil prices quadrupled. Oil prices quadrupled despite the fact that the total disruption in oil supply during the roughly 3 months that the embargo lasted was about 4% of global oil supply. Now, I just mentioned to you that the total global oil supply that goes through the Strait of Hormuz is 20%. So the scale of this disruption that the Iranians could bring about would be even greater than the one that was brought about in 1973 that caused a quadrupling of oil prices. Now, the Iranians absolutely do have the military capacity to disrupt virtually all commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a war strategy that they've been gaming out and that they've been preparing for well over a decade. And they're well prepared to do this. And one reason that we know that they can be successful at this is that we just have to look at the success that the Houthis of Yemen have had in essentially shutting down commercial traffic through the Red Sea in the last couple of years. They've essentially managed to shut off about 75% of all traffic through the Red Sea and force commercial shipping to go basically use other routes. And the Iranians have many fold more resources and capabilities to affect the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz than the Houthis have of disrupting shipping through the Red Sea. So we know through the type of tactics and strategies that the Houthis have implemented that the Iranians would be able to have considerable success in shutting commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, why would they do that? Well, precisely if the Iranians managed to shut traffic of oil through the Strait of Hormuz and oil prices tripled, quadrupled, or even more, this would cause a massive spike in global inflation, a massive recessions around the world, just like they did in 1973 and 1974. And there would be enormous international pressure from all nations around the world to bring a very quick end to the conflict. Essentially, the Iranians would be able to blackmail the world and say, hey, unless you, rest of the world, are able to get Israel off our backs and halt their attacks on us and halt the attacks on us by the United States, we're going to block the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, the entire world is essentially going to be pressuring Israel and the United States to end its attacks on Iran. And this is the means by which the Iranian regime believes that it can save itself, through this blackmail that they're able to execute by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Now, a complementary strategy that the Iranians have also discussed is attacking various oil production and oil transport facilities throughout the Middle East. So they can attack oil production and oil transport facilities in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in United Arab Emirates, and all around the region. In Iraq, they can actually shut down oil production, shut down transport of oil by firing their guided missiles, some of which are actually hypersonic missiles, which essentially these nations have no defense against, and not even the United States is able to really fully defend uh, these various facilities in the Middle East against Iranian attacks that would be aimed at oil infrastructure in the Middle East. So the Iranians basically have the military capacity to cause a oil price shock that is equal to or greater than the one that happened in 73, 74, and that could cause massive inflation and global recession around the world. And that is their strategy in the event of an all-out war. Now, the Iranians don't want this. As I said, they don't want an all-out war. They also don't want to shut down the Strait of Hormuz or do any of this, because they also know that they would essentially become sort of an enemy of the world in that scenario, an enemy of uh, particularly of their neighbors, such as Saudi Arabia, that export oil through there. And so they wouldn't want to do that. They would only do that if they feel themselves to be existentially threatened. But the reality is that they will be existentially threatened if there is an all out war between Israel and Iran, in which the United States is almost certainly to intervene on the side of Iran. And as I said, this is exactly the scenario which the Israelis are looking for. They're not looking, of course, to have a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. No, they are looking to existentially threaten the Iranian regime. They don't just want to defeat the Iranian regime militarily and take out their nuclear facilities. They want this regime to collapse. They want to weaken this regime so profoundly that the regime collapses, and it gives opportunity for other forces in Iran to take over. Now, the Iranians know this. They know that they will be existentially threatened. And the way that they believe that they can protect themselves is by using this sort of blackmail.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, Israel is not wanting to wipe out the Iranian people. They want to wipe out the political establishment, like you said, this fanatical party that has taken root in Iran, which is now guiding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard through this very extreme viewpoint of Mahdiism, bringing about the 12th Imam, who is their Messiah. And that cannot happen until there is a direct conflict between Iran and Israel. And from my understanding, and you actually have links out to a number of different papers that go through all of the comments and what's happening in Iran and what has happened over the past decade or more.
One of the things I just want to point out is that Mahdiism itself does not actually imply a war with the Israelis, or let's say an apocalyptic type of a war against the Israelis. This is a relatively new interpretation that's gained a lot of strength within Iran, and particularly within the leaders, religious leadership, and amongst the military. So Mahdiism is something that's been around for centuries, but this is a relatively novel interpretation. This idea that it's the responsibility of the Iranian regime, and in particular of the IRGC, to kind of set the stage for the return of the 12th Imam, and that the setting of the stage is essentially going to involve a war with Israel. This is a very modern, a new, sort of revolutionary interpretation. It's not one that is by any means a necessary way that Mahdiism has to be interpreted or practiced. In fact, traditionally that was never the case. It's simply that this is something that's become more and more popular, let's say, and more entrenched within the religious and military leadership in Iran, and that's why this is so dangerous. The other point that I'd like to make is that with regards to nuclear weapons, it's actually been the stated policy of the Iranian religious leadership, led by their supreme leader, Khamenei, to not develop nuclear weapons. Their strategy of wiping Israel off the face of the earth is one like this one of how you described it, of death through a thousand cuts.
Hmm.
They have a very long-term plan. It's not just going to be that they're going to nuke Israel. It's really that by 2040, through a very long-term patient plan, one which exercises strategic patience, they essentially run the Israelis out of Israel over time, over a very long and drawn out asymmetric conflict, guerrilla ground warfare, and also guerrilla tactics of just shooting missiles into Israel, terrorizing the Israelis. That's actually their plan. Their plan isn't actually to destroy Israel with nuclear weapons. They've been pretty, I would say, if anything, publicly pretty clear that they do not intend to develop nuclear weapons. However, they have said that if they believe that their regime is existentially threatened by Israel, that they would go ahead and develop it. And so that's why they've actually kind of gone ahead and developed a nuclear program that would enable them to produce the nuclear material that would go into a nuclear weapon. That's why they have a nuclear weapons program that would enable them to develop a weapon once they actually have the nuclear material. But they actually haven't, as far as intelligence services are able to detect, and as far as the actual statements of Iran's leaders have not actually given the green light to actually produce a nuclear weapon. And it's not actually a part of their explicit strategy to develop a nuclear weapon in order to, let's say, bomb Israel with a nuclear weapon. Their plan is actually, like I said, more of this long, drawn out conflict and death through a thousand cuts.
Well, it's interesting because if you do have a nuclear weapon, and if you're using proxies in order to achieve these stated goals of eliminating Israel by 2040, in that case, sure, you may say, well, we're not going to directly launch nuclear weapons against Israel. That's not the way that we're hoping to do it. But then again, why not use a proxy group and then use a tactical nuclear weapon when needed? So, in my mind, it seems like it's semantics. Whatever is going to achieve your goal, once you have nuclear weapons,
Yeah, yeah.
and if it's going to accelerate things in that direction, then so be it. I could very, very easily see that being justified theologically or politically, however you want to put it.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I just wanted to make that kind of distinction, but you're right. Basically, the idea is that they would have a nuclear umbrella that would be able to protect their proxy strategy. So their strategy is really to try to bring about the end of Israel through these sort of proxy wars. But if they have a nuclear option, they would have an umbrella that would always be able to sort of say, well, the Israelis, for example, now can go after the head of the octopus that is financing and supporting all these proxies. And so the Israelis today can actually go after the head of the octopus, which is Iran. But if Iran possesses a nuclear weapon, then the Israelis won't be able to ever go after the head of the octopus. They'll always have to be dealing with these um, proxy forces and fighting this highly asymmetric conflict, which the Iranians believe, and perhaps correctly so, it is a war that the Israelis wouldn't really be able to win, because it would just be nonstop asymmetric warfare that they would be faced with from all sides. And this would eventually exhaust the Israeli population. It would exhaust their economy and bring about a destruction of the state of Israel. So possessing a nuclear weapon fits in well, and would be a complement to their ring of fire strategy. But I just wanted to just point out that their objective isn't so much to actually use the nuclear weapon on Israel, because they know that that would just bring about a retaliation. It would be sort of it would bring about a holocaust on the Iranian population, where the Israelis, who possess something like over 100 nuclear weapons, would just bomb all of Iran, and the Iranians realized that that would be that would be suicidal. But by the same token, by possessing a nuclear weapon, they would be able to freely go about financing and arming these various proxy groups that are engaging in this asymmetric warfare against the Israelis.
So, a lot of interesting things that you've given us, James, to chew on and think about. And I appreciate you going into far more depth than what you did even in your article. Again, I want to point out there's a bunch of links in that article to various documents, to various statements that have been made, backing what you said up. This is not you providing your opinion. You're just stating the facts as they exist. And in your opinion, though, we should point out that when you gather all this together, you think that there is a fairly high probability that we could see an all-out war develop after the election outcome is revealed just by next week. Obviously, we'll have to see how long it takes to tally the votes and all that. But if it's done quickly, we could be looking at something as early as, well, November, next week or in the week following. So just a good scenario to keep in mind. And I want to point out that the US military is absolutely thinking about this very situation, this very scenario as we speak, as you pointed out, deploying forces in the Middle Eastern region. So they're thinking about this. And I guess we're just going to have to see how things play out.
Yeah, it's going to be very tense. I think that the timing of all this and the sequence of the events is highly uncertain. But I think that when we keep in mind what Israel's strategic objectives are, the strategic objectives that we know of, because they've actually been stated pretty clearly by a number of their different leaders, and by just analyzing Israel's strategic situation, we can see that there is a strategic urgency for Israel to confront Iran while it has the upper hand. And so while we're not really sure about the exact timing of the sequence of events, we are pretty confident that there is going to eventually be this all out war between Israel and Iran, and that it's going to happen pretty quickly. And this has tremendous ramifications for the global economy, as for reasons that I pointed out a little while ago. And this is something that provides a very unique opportunity for investors, because it's not this often that you have a global crisis of this nature brought about by a major oil price shock. And, we've had this a few times historically. In fact, there's been 10 oil price shocks, major oil price shocks in the history of the United States in 1945. 8 of those occasions have been associated with business cycle recessions, either having caused that business cycle recession or having significantly contributed to the business cycle recession. And on the other 2 occasions that there have been major oil shocks, it actually caused a major slowdown in the economy and sort of a near recession. And so, in addition, in most of these cases, the oil price shocks were associated with bear market declines of 20% or more. Out of these 10 occasions, let's say the less severe decline in equities was about a 15% decline, but the median decline was over 20%. So major oil price shocks have historically had a major impact on the US economy, on the global economy, and on the stock markets. Markets are clearly not pricing in much of a risk premium in oil prices, which are near 52-week lows at the present time. So the market is in for a very, very severe shock if what I've been saying actually comes out to be true. And that, again, is what provides an opportunity, because if the market had already been discounting all of this and you saw it discounted in prices, then there wouldn't be much of an opportunity. But the reason that this is such an opportunity right now is that prices really aren't discounting very much risk at all from this sort of scenario. But I believe that this risk materializing is well over 50%. And so that's where I think that there really is a very interesting opportunity for investors right now.
All right, James. Well, if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you and find out more, we have listeners from all over the world. What would be the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Well, the first way would be through investoracumen.com. That would be the most important way. And they can also get in touch with me through Seeking Alpha Marketplace service, where I have a service there, and also through Seeking Alpha, there's a messaging system now there that they can contact me by why. But if they want to contact me directly, best to do it through investoracumen.com. But they can also check out my service on the Seeking Alpha Marketplace called Successful Portfolio Strategy.
Perfect. And I'll have a link out to some of those links, including the article that we discussed where this interview is located on Financial Sense. James, always a pleasure to get your very interesting outside the box views for our podcast and our listeners today. And we definitely look forward to speaking with you in the future. Tell us, what did you think about what we discussed today? Send us your feedback by going to Financial Sense and hitting where it says contact us, or you can email me directly at CRIS, that's Chris with no H, at financialsense.com. Also, be sure to spread the word about FS Insider with others and on social media. Our podcast is sponsored by Financial Sense Wealth Management, providing high net worth investors with financial planning and asset management services. Give us a call at 888-486-3939 if you'd like to speak with a member of our team. For FS Insider, I'm Cris Sheridan. Thanks for listening.
The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the News Hour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the Financial Sense staff and do not take into account listener suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense News Hour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies mentioned in Financial Sense or arising out of the use of any material on the News Hour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.